Well, a mountain fire which broke out in Paarl above the Toitskloof pass overnight has been pushed to the Wellington side of the mountain by strong winds. 4 helicopters are still waterbombing while over 200 firefighters remain on the scene. Earlier, more than 100 people were evacuated from farms in the area as a safety precaution. At least one house has been completely gutted so far. Firefighters in Cape Town are monitoring possible hotspots after fire broke out on the slopes of Table Mountain on Monday night. This is the second massive fire in as many weeks. Well, Grant Smith is a field officer at the Endangered Wildlife Trust. He joins us now from our Seapoint studios to speak about the environmental impact of such fires, especially on the rich fynbos kingdom there. Good afternoon, Grant, and thank you so much for your time on the SABC News Desk. All right, Grant, I'm struggling to hear you, but the frequency of such fires is concerning. How does it impact on the long-term survival of fynbos in the area?
I think that before we start, we need to understand that fynbos is a fire-driven ecosystem. So in areas where the fire burns too often, too regularly, then it can be a concern. So for example, Signal Hill in Cape Town, there we get fires almost every year, sometimes multiple times in a year. So the fynbos there has transformed virtually into a grassland. So it does become a concern if the fires are too regular. But on the other hand, fynbos needs fire. You know, without fire, there would actually be no fynbos. So on an ecological perspective, from an ecological perspective, we actually need fire for fynbos to persist. So in Somerset West, the fires was still, the vegetation was quite new, about 8 years old, but that's still acceptable. And on Table Mountain, a lot of that vegetation was nearly 17 years old. So that's quite acceptable for fynbos and actually healthy for fynbos ecosystem.
Grant, why is fire essential to maintaining the fynbos-dominated ecosystem like this one? We know it's been less than a year since the fires last March. Is there sufficient time for the regeneration of the species?
You know, I think we need to remember that often when a fire burns, let's say, for example, again in Table Mountain or now to Toitskloof, it seems like it's burning the entire mountain, but it burns in almost a patchwork mosaic type fashion. So you have islands of vegetation that are left over. And so although there were big fires in Cape Town last year, the City of Cape Town and the Biodiversity Management Branch, they've released a report showing that the areas that were burned last year actually haven't been affected this year. And so that fynbos actually needed to burn. So what happens is that fynbos actually thrives on nutrient-poor soils. So when a fire comes through, those nutrients in the ash actually return to the soil, meaning that there's rejuvenation, and the seedlings actually germinate. They're stimulated by the fire. And then your understory vegetation, your bulbs and your annual vegetation, they actually sprout, they grow, then they flower, and then they set seed, and they go through the entire life cycle before that fynbos actually reaches an adult stage again. If the adults don't get fire, then they can die off and not have not be able to regenerate afterwards.
Grant, would more managed burns perhaps be a more viable option here, where controlled fires actually burn tracts of fynbos and then of course limit damage to surrounding areas and property? But of course there are various legal implications and penalization codes to consider. Just your thoughts on that one, Grant.
Yeah, I think realistically speaking, I think there is consensus that fire needs to be managed, and I think that we are moving towards a more preemptive approach. Although there have been prescribed burns, you know, fire management is a strategy that is used. I think that there's realization that there's a more integrated approach is needed, and in fact, a project was launched last year by the Global Environmental Facility, and it's a collaboration between the United Nations Development Programme and the South African government that is looking at collaborating between public entities, between landowners, between governments, and also very importantly looking into the research needed to understand what fynbos needs and how this fire can be managed better. We also need to remember that we are going through climate change, and there's there's research that indicates that the hot, drier temperatures and the droughts that we're experiencing could actually see us having more wildfires in the future. But before we can manage that, we need to understand the system better. So there is research programs in place at the moment that are looking to try and integrate those approaches, but there really is no simple answer. So yes, fire management does need to be taken into account, and I think that is where we're moving towards, but it's incredibly complex. And like you say, if you do a prescribed burn and property gets damaged, then who's responsible for that?
A property destroyed yet again this year, Grant. How crucial would you say is good urban planning to mitigate such fires? And tell us why it's so crucial that urban planners actually keep their development below the natural plant line. And do you feel that they're actually adhering to this guideline in the Cape?
Yeah, I think that urban planning obviously is critical. It's very important. You know, we are at a stage now where we have already encroached so far in natural areas that, you know, we cannot shift the responsibility onto urban planners alone. The responsibility has to lie amongst all the role players and all the stakeholders. So your government officials, again, your management authorities, but then also your public groups. So there's fire protection agencies like the Cape Fire Protection Agencies that tries to lobby people together and work together to do fire breaks, do fire management, fire risk assessments. And so all of these things need to work together for the benefit of all.
Thank you, Grant, for sharing your insights with us here on the SABC News Desk. That was Grant Smith. He's a field officer at the Endangered Wildlife Trust, joining us, of course, from our Seapoint studios in Cape Town.